Well, we talked about Bill Gaines' testimony before the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency and how that led to the establishment of the Comics Code Authority, the CCA, which in turn led to the eventually to the demise of EC Comics, one of the most successful companies going at that time, as well as, for all intents and purposes, the demise, at least as people had known it, of the very popular horror genre in comic books. No more vampires, no more werewolves or zombies or ghouls. But they didn't say anything about the sort of monsters that were haunting drive-in theaters at that time. Monsters not from the supernatural, not from gothic tales, but rather from the moon or from Mars, from outer space, or giant lizards and other creatures that were either created by or awoken by radiation and or atomic testing. So these things were not excluded. Therefore, guess what? They started showing up, particularly over at Atlas Comics, alias Marvel, and particularly from the creative team of Stan Lee and artist Jack Kirby, who just went through a small army in the mid to late 1950s, a small army of bizarre creatures with even more bizarre names introduced on the splash pages of these various Atlas comics as these giant creatures with scurrying humans running from them in fear. Some of them even eventually had kind of a second life with the advent of the Silver Age and the Marvel Age of comics in the 60s and beyond that. Some of them gestated for a long time before they became a part eventually of the Marvel mainstream, like this one, for instance, from a 1959 issue of Tales to Astonish. Groot, the monster from Planet X, a giant tree monster, who eventually started showing up in the comics as a member of the Guardians of the Galaxy in the 2000s, and you may have seen him somewhere or other. Nevertheless, that kind of outer space monster thing was very much a niche market compared to the EC type horror magazines, horror comics that had been doing so well from 1950 to 1954. Well, what remained, what was left standing after the Comics Code Authority was established? Well, there were still plenty of funny animal comics, and we'll take a brief look at those later. But the really big thing, the two big trends in the mid-50s after the CCA was established were Westerns and war comics. Westerns had a big wave of popularity in 1948 or so, and had quickly kind of subsided, but they had made a comeback, in large part because by the 1950s there were westerns on television, and there were a lot of them, so there was renewed interest. Particularly, well, speaking of television, if we're talking about the subcommittee hearings about juvenile delinquency and the CCA and all, television has to become a factor, because part of the fact that the popularity of comics fell off so much after 1954 was because of the negative publicity. Part of it was because the very sensational and titillating subjects that EC and others had specialized in were no longer available. That probably helped to the decline of sales. But television played a part as well, because by the mid-1950s, most American families had a television, and that's free entertainment if you're willing to sit through the commercials. And so kids were glued to the tube, which had not been a thing in the 1940s when comic books really were at the peak of their popularity. Now, war comics been very popular through World War II, then kind of subsided, came back around during the Korean War, and mid-1950s they were still going strong. Now, there were still superheroes, but there were essentially only three of them. Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. Although, if you want to count Robin, then you got four, I guess. Can't really count Superboy separate from Superman. They're the same guy. So anyway, they're still around, but the plot lines of the DC superhero comics in the 50s got progressively, I want to say weirder, but stupid. Stupid's a good word. Here are just some examples, and really, honest to goodness, I could have just picked any cover from any of these books pretty much at random, and you would have had some pretty goofy stuff going on, because you can't have any real peril, you can't have any really vicious criminals, so options became limited. Now, I do find it interesting there on the far right, that issue of Batman, when for some reason Batman is compulsively forced to paint a portrait of his own secret identity. And if you look closely, then I believe that this issue is definitive evidence that Ben Affleck is the Bruce Wayne. In order to get kind of a good overview, kind of a cross-section of what the comic book industry was looking like after the establishment of the CCA, I want to zoom in on a couple of companies in particular, and then also just kind of take a broader view of the others, and see what they were publishing in early 1956. And we're going to start with DC Comics, which has the DC logo, as you can see, right opposite the CCA sticker, but still officially on paper is known as National. Well, they did have superhero titles. They had 9 of them at that time. That doesn't mean they had 9 superheroes. They just had those 3 superheroes who were left: Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. Batman and Robin, of course. So it's 9 titles of different combinations and iterations of the big 3 who were left. So you've got Action Comics that had started it all in 1938. You have Adventure Comics featuring Superboy and Crypto, the Dog of Steel. Oddly enough, that same month that Crypto, the Dog of Steel, is being featured on the cover of Adventure. Over in Batman, we see the return of the Bat Hound. That is to say, Ace the Bat Hound, apparently a master canine detective. We also have Detective Comics with a backup feature, Manhunter from Mars, and that was actually a new superhero character introduced in the 50s. That is an opportunity, I guess. He didn't have his own title. So Detective Comics, Superboy, right? He's got 2 titles, Adventure and Superboy. And then you've got Superman. Here he is facing the Midget Menace from outer space. And to wrap things up, we have Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen, which kind of does double duty. It can count as a superhero comic because Superman is always in it, and it's also kind of a teen comic along the lines of Archie because Jimmy Olsen is the focus. Then you've got Wonder Woman, who, unlike Superman and Batman, did not have multiple titles. She only had the one. And in this month's issue, she's in danger of being put in the Amazon flea circus. So I guess the big themes for DC superheroes in January 1956 were smart dogs and a fear of being captured by little people. Then you've got a comic titled World's Finest. Now that had started, I think, in 1941 or so, and it would run for, almost 45 years until the mid-80s. And World's Finest, or later it was called World's Finest Comics, it always featured a story, a cover story, with Batman and Superman together. Maybe with Robin, depending on the time period. Around that time, the early 1940s, in the Superman radio program, Batman and Robin had guest starred, and Batman and Superman had, because they're both pretty smart, figured out each other's secret identities. So they share each other's secret, and they're the best of pals. And so once a month, while they're doing other things in their own titles, each of them with 2 titles, they've also got one title where they're hanging out together, and that would, like I said, that would last for several decades. So like I said, 9 superhero titles in all. Essentially the only superhero titles left anywhere. By the way, that was out of 48 titles altogether that DC was putting out each month in 1956. I'm pretty sure that all of DC's titles were monthly. Some of the smaller and less popular or less successful companies had titles that may only come out every 2 months, or in some cases only every 3 months. But DC, they were all monthly. Well, in addition to Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, DC also had their share of war comics, including the old standby that had been around since the early 1940s, Black Hawk, and some more conventional comics like All-American Men of War and G.I. Combat, which would also wind up lasting for decades. In addition to those 3, they had 3 others. Our Army at War, that one also would last for decades. Fighting Forces, and Star-Spangled War Stories. All right, so there you go, 6 war titles. They also had a handful of general kind of adventure titles. The Brave and the Bold featured medieval knights at that time. Well, the Viking Prince and the Golden Gladiator, so sort of swords and sandals, as they said in the 1950s. Later on in the 1960s, the Brave and the Bold would become, actually before then, at the beginning of the 60s, it would become a superhero title, but we'll talk about that later. Then there was one called My Greatest Adventure, which was an anthology book. In this particular case, the adventure is one of a very science fiction kind of approach. And then there was Showcase. Showcase was just what it sounds like. It was a showcase for different things. If they wanted to introduce a new character to see if it would be popular, they might put it in Showcase first to see how it did. Or they might have themes, like this particular issue in the March issue of 1956. All the stories were about firefighters, and sometimes they would have one where all the stories are about police officers or something like that. And DC also had their share of westerns in 1956, most of which had been already around for a few years by that point. all-star western starring the Trigger Twins. Hopalong Cassidy, which was not a DC original but a licensed character. Hopalong Cassidy had been around at that point for almost 50 years. Started off as a character in novels in the 1900s, then later appeared in pulp magazines and radio programs, and then at the movies, played by William Boyd, starting back in the 1930s. So a well-established Western character that DC had the rights to. Western comics featuring Pow Wow Smith. Also, in addition to those three traditional Westerns, they had another title that was kind of like halfway between a Western and one of those historical adventure stories. It was called Tomahawk. And it was a Western in the sense that, like New York during the American Revolution was the West. That's when it was set during the Revolution. Although there was later a version that was set in the Old West about a character who was supposed to be a descendant of this one. So just those four, so far as the Westerns go. They also had a couple of crime comics still going, but these were not the crime comics of EC, nor were they the crime does not pay type things from the 40s. Very different. Mr. District Attorney is the first one. The second one, Gangbusters, which also is not a DC original but a licensed property. Gangbusters was a very popular radio program about a special police unit that was supposed to take down gangsters. So this is the sort of thing that you can expect post Comics Code Authority when you do see crime in comics. You've got the brave policeman being interviewed by the police, and you've got the subtitle of the comic, "You Can't Beat the Law." DC also still held on to a horror comic of sorts, House of Mystery. Now even before the Comics Code, DC had not gone to the same lengths EC had. But House of Mystery was, well, you couldn't call it a horror title because you were not allowed to use that word in titles. But it was sort of in the sense of kind of like a Twilight Zone episode, one of the milder Twilight Zone episodes. There's not a lot of horrifying stuff. There's not a lot of violence. Just kind of some mysterious goings on. There were also mysterious goings on in space. These three titles, at that time anthology titles, those strange adventures would eventually become something else entirely, were stories of a science fiction bent, like Gorillas in Space, and over there on the right, Tales of the Unexpected, A Dragon Man from Mars. You got to admit, that is unexpected. DC also had three teen life comics that were clearly patterned after the Archie comics. In fact, you'll notice that the guys on these covers either they kind of look like Archie, 2 out of the 3, or they've got a similar pattern to their name. So instead of Archie, you've got Buzzy, Binky, and Oogie. Now, Leave It to Binky actually lasted until 1971. In addition to that, you also had a couple of romance comics, girls' love stories, and girls' romances. I am pleased that they have the apostrophe in the right place. Girls' romances, love stories that could happen to you. And you can see there's a lot of swooning going on in these. And as we talked about before, that's the primary difference between the teen life and the romance comics, even though, there's a romance element to, A Date with Judy or Leave It to Binky. Speaking of Binkies, there were also several titles DC had that were geared toward really young readers. Funny animal comics is what they're often called. All of them weren't about animals. All of them had a very sort of cartoony feel to them. You had Flippity and Flop, who apparently were a kind of a third-rate version of Tweety and Sylvester. You had The Fox and the Crow. You had Peter Porkchops. None of these, by the way, have left a lasting legacy in the pages of comicdom or animation. You had Real Screen Comics, which is a second vehicle for The Fox and the Crow. And then notice Sugar and Spike. We talked about them briefly once before. That's not a funny animal comic. It's about cute talking babies. But it had started back in the 1940s, so it had been around for a while, and it would continue well into the 1970s. And you'll notice the signature down there, Sheldon Meyer. You'll also see his signature on the sixth cartoony title, The Three Mouseketeers. I'm assuming that didn't last long because it was around this time the Mickey Mouse Club started showing up on TV calling their kids Mouseketeers. So this probably wasn't allowed to continue. Sheldon Meyer there as well. Sheldon Meyer being a really prominent and significant editor at DC Comics, who also drew these types of cartoony, funny animal comics. Finally, to round out our 48 DC titles of January of 1956, I have three here that are kind of hard to put in any of the other categories. You've got The Adventures of Rex the Wonder Dog. Smart dogs, they're taking over the DC universe. Here he is giving his autographs via paw print. And you'll notice in this issue, he joins the Foreign Legion. Then you've got these last couple of titles, licensed properties based on real people that were very, very famous, popular comedians. Bob Hope. I think they started making these around 1950, and they made them through 1959, I'm thinking. Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, really popular comedy team. Also, The Adventures of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis from 1952 is when that started. Then Martin and Lewis broke up. Dean Martin was the straight man. If you don't know your comedy lingo and comedy teams, you've got the straight man and the funny man, right? The straight man is the guy that feeds the funny guy their lines. In most cases, the straight guy is the romantic interest. So Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis broke up in 1957, and the comic book continued, but they cut Dean Martin out of it, so you can see who they thought was important, and it became The Adventures of Jerry Lewis. It also lasted until 1971, when there was kind of a general purging of these types of humor comics from DC. All right, that's where DC Comics, or National, were as of the beginning of 1956. Everything that we saw has the little CCA stamp in the upper right-hand corner, approved by the Comics Code Authority. So you had still 9 superhero comics, all about the same 3 superheroes. You had, I think, 4 westerns, you had 6 war comics, and then you had just kind of a variety of different things, including romance and teen stuff, and several that were geared toward a much younger audience. All right, well, that's DC. Well, let's take a quick overview at what else was popular in the mid-1950s. Dell Gold Key Whitman were putting out all those licensed properties that we looked at earlier, and a handful of their own stuff, like The Adventures of Turok, Son of Stone, was coming out by 1956. But from the licensed characters, their most popular ones were based on very popular animated cartoons like Bugs Bunny and Woody Woodpecker, and their most popular were the ones based on Disney properties, especially Carl Barks's Donald Duck. In the lower right, you can see the Lone Ranger. That was another of Dell's more popular titles, so popular that not only did the Lone Ranger have his book, but his faithful companion Tonto had his own book, and the Lone Ranger's horse Silver had his own book. Tonto's horse Scout was just kind of left out. Also, you had the various Archie comics, which by 1956 had all the titles that we've talked about. They had the original Pep starring Archie, then they had Archie, then they had Betty and Veronica, they had Jughead, they had Archie's joke book, and they had Little Archie. So lots of Archie. The right-hand corner there, that's our representative image from Harvey Comics, who by 1956 had Casper and Wendy the friendly ghost and Richie Rich, the poor little rich boy. Within another year or so, they would have added Baby Huey and Hot Stuff, the little devil in diapers. And then the lower left there, that's a sample, a representative from Cowboy Western Comics, which is a title from Charlton, which had become a thing by 1956. One of several kind of third-string comics companies at this time, that many of which had been making horror comics or crime comics, but that's kind of gone around the bend now. And so they're all making lots of westerns. All right. Well, let's also take a more detailed look at another company, Atlas, alias Marvel. In the beginning of 1956, Atlas was putting out, it varied through the year, but up to 60 titles a month, most of them monthly. In fact, I think all of them were monthly. So they're putting out a lot of stuff. They're not making nearly the dent that DC was making, or that Dell was making. By the way, DC had an advantage also where it came to television, because Superman had become a very popular television series, a live-action series at that time. Forgot to mention that. Atlas didn't have anything that was showing up on TV. They did have one holdover from the crime comics trend, Tales of Justice. And you can see how Post CCA, this is the whole thing is set up to conform, at least nominally, to the requirements of the Comics Code Authority. So Tales of Justice, and the subheading is True Tales, proving justice always wins. They also had a medieval adventure title, The Black Knight. That character would by the 1960s, there would be a superhero, a Marvel superhero called the Black Knight, who's supposed to be a descendant of this one from England, and has a very similar costume, and who is going to be showing up, as I understand it, in the Eternals movie whenever that finally comes out. By the time you see this, I don't know, maybe it will have been out. Anyway, they got that. They have two Jungle Girl comics, Jan of the Jungle and Lorna the Jungle Girl, two of about a dozen that were out there at this time. Well, as of 1956, Atlas had only one little kids comic, Homer, the Happy Ghost. And if that sounds like it's a ripoff of Casper the Friendly Ghost, that's because it very clearly is. I mean, Homer is Casper with freckles, basically. They also had a humor magazine, a satirical magazine that was mostly parodies of popular movies and TV shows called Riot, which may also seem like kind of an imitation of EC's comic Mad, and that's because it was. Now, they also put out this, on the far right, Snafu. Snafu, by the way, is a military term. It's an acronym. It goes back possibly to World War I, but definitely to World War II. It means situation normal, all effed up. And this magazine, you'll notice it's 25 cents, not 10 cents. That's because it's not a comic book. It is a regular-sized black and white magazine. Now, if that sounds like a ripoff of Mad Magazine, it's not really, because it beat Mad to the stands by a few months. But unlike Mad, this one did not have any staying power. It didn't really last long. Atlas also had its share of Western comics, including the Big Three that had all started in 1948 and would all run until 1977-78. Two Gun Kid, Kid Colt Outlaw, and Rawhide Kid. I'm not kidding. Stan Lee liked to call people kid. So, there. They had the Big Three, and then they also had several others, more than a dozen others, 15 in all, just in 1 month, in January of 1956. You had Wyatt Earp, a historical figure, as was Annie Oakley. You had Gunsmoke Western featuring Kid Colt Outlaw. And you also had Wild Western featuring Kid Colt Outlaw. Guess which character was the most popular Western character at that time? Then you had the various kids: Outlaw Kid, Ringo Kid, Apache Kid, Western Kid, and so forth. Many of these were drawn by either Jack Kirby or John Severin, who did a lot of the covers as well, or Al Williamson also did quite a few of them. Stan Lee wrote most of them. Like DC, Atlas had several titles that would fit into the teen life genre, a couple of which we talked about before, back when we first discussed Archie. Millie the Model and Patsy Walker, both starting in the late 1940s. Now, Patsy Walker was sort of at the height of her popularity in 1956. So you not only had Patsy Walker, you also had Patsy Walker in Miss America, which had previously been a superhero title. Then you had one just about Patsy and her pal Hetty called Patsy and Hetty. Then you had one about Patsy and her other pals called Patsy and her pals. Then you had one about someone who apparently was not one of Patsy's pals. Pearl, My Girl Pearl. The superscription, Pearl the Teenage Doll. Now, starting just a couple of issues after this one, they replaced the Teenage Doll with So Beautiful, but Oh So Dumb. The dumb blonde stereotype personified. This one did not have the staying power that Millie the Model and Patsy Walker did, and it's sort of cringeworthy now. And further, you can see that they're really trying to imitate the Archie comics look, although adding to it quite a bit of meanness, really. Well, the question arises, if Atlas had teen life titles like DC, did they also, like DC, have a couple of romance titles? Well, no, they didn't have a couple of romance titles. They had virtually all the romance titles. They had 10 at least coming out monthly. And as True Secrets tells us, they have all the drama and romance of true life. Now, you might think from this that there was a big romance trend at the time, but the big romance trend had kind of trended and gone in the late 1940s. But Atlas was still putting a lot of their eggs in that basket and pretty well cornering the market, just about, for young female readers who were interested. Well, they may not have all been female readers, but young readers who were interested in this sort of thing.